Hitler never should have lost World War II. And before the summer of 1941, it didn't look like anyone could stop him. World War I was characterized by defender's advantage, but new technology enabled the Germans to unveil new tactics. They would attack simultaneously with tanks, infantry, and aircraft in coordinated rapid assaults to overwhelm defenders. They named it Blitzkrieg, literally meaning lightning war. German tank technology at the beginning of the war was unmatched. Each was equipped with its own radio, allowing for a new level of coordination. No other military in the world had adopted this practice. Before the war in 1936, Germany took control of the Rhineland, a highly industrialized zone that the World War I allies were taking as payment for Germany's first rampage through Europe 20 years prior. 2 years later, Hitler took control of the Sudetenland, an area of Czechoslovakia with many ethnic Germans living in it. Then a year later, in March 1939, he invaded the country. Germany had been gradually preparing for war and violating its disarmament agreements. Stalin begged Western leaders to intervene, though they did not take the communist leaders seriously. Finding no help from Western powers, the Soviets decided to sign a non-aggression pact with Germany. It cannot be overstated, the balance of power in Europe had now substantially shifted. In the next month, both the Soviet Union and Germany would invade Poland. Britain and France finally responded to German aggressions and declared war. The Nazis would then begin their sweep through Central Europe. They would easily defeat Denmark and Norway in April, and then Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg in May. Germany now set its eyes on its mainland European rival. France has constructed a 280-mile line of fortifications, the Maginot Line. Steel reinforced bunkers, landmines, and trenches guard the German-France border. To the north is the Ardennes, a supposedly impassable area of forest. The Germans, after swiftly conquering Belgium, pour through the only unguarded spot on France's eastern border through Belgium. The French military failed to adapt to the modern military doctrine, and Paris fell within 6 weeks. The English Channel protects Britain for now, and by September 1941, the Axis power controlled almost the entire continent, and most fighting had ceased. Germany now has a vast network of natural resources to feed its industrial capacity. They had every advantage. On the other side of the world, Japan has conquered huge swaths of land in Southeast Asia. They reach from the north tip of China into Siberia, to the island of Papua New Guinea. The Americans were reluctant to get involved officially in the war. FDR promised in his 1940 election campaign,
"Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign war."
Though according to his own words, they waged a war without a declaration, up until the day the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And now begins a long string of catastrophic errors made by Hitler himself. Instead of finishing off the major European players, namely the British, Hitler decides to pursue his policy of Lebensraum, translating to living space, a plan to systemically starve the Slavic people to death in labor camps, while moving German settlers in their place. Hitler needed the economic power of this German superstate in his plan for world domination. But Hitler also hated the Slavic people. A better word would be disgusted. He saw them literally as vermin, and he refused to share a sphere of influence or a border with a Slavic nation. 2 years after signing a non-aggression pact with the Soviets, Hitler planned Operation Barbarossa. Hitler did not include their ally, the Japanese, in this invasion. He deemed them too racially inferior and did not want to share any of the land with them. It would be the largest military expedition of all time. Before the attack, they destroyed the USSR's command and control capability by cutting communication wires, effectively severing the lines of communication between Soviet high command and their soldiers for the first month of the war. Germany swiftly advanced through parts of Eastern Europe, and instead of pulling conquered peoples who were loyal to Stalin out of fear, he massacred them instead. The Germans would use envelopment tactics, surrounding large amounts of Soviet troops and then turning their focus inward. 300,000 at Smolensk, 650,000 at Kiev, and 1.2 million between Bryansk and Vyazma. The momentum could have brought them all the way to Moscow, but Hitler overruled his military strategists and decided to attack Ukraine, citing it as being the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. This is referred to as Hitler's summer pause. Soviet high command knew their forward positions were untenable, so they pulled back large amounts of forces to defend key strongholds and instituted a scorched earth policy, destroying their own factories, bridges, and crops as they retreated. The Soviets were putting up a fight and inflicting more German casualties than they had ever received, particularly in their middle officer corps. Soviet snipers would deliberately trap themselves behind enemy lines, just to get a chance to take out a platoon leader. In September, the Germans would start their 900-day siege of Leningrad. Soldiers and civilians would be trapped behind enemy lines with no supplies for 4 years. 1.5 million Soviets would die, including 400,000 children. The Wehrmacht pushed towards Moscow in the autumn after conquering the Ukraine, but it became clear by December that they would not have the strength to capture the city, and the Russian winter was setting in. Germans had not expected such fierce resistance, and Allied military leaders thought the USSR would collapse in 3 months. They did not supply their frontline troops with winter jackets. Gasoline would freeze in their vehicles and supply lines would come to a halt. For the first time, the Nazi war machine had been stalled. Fresh veteran reinforcements from Siberia would arrive in January, specializing in winter fighting. The Soviets would now go on the offensive. The Germans could only commit to large-scale operations in the summer and autumn months. There is an intense mud season before and after each Soviet winter. In the summer of '42, the Germans would again go on the attack, this time in the southern Caucasus oil fields. But by now, the German military has been depleted. It has lost valuable infantry and veteran officers that had to be replaced with subpar reservists and boys. Instead of the German line being up and down effective, they now had to concentrate their best troops into a battering ram formation, while having the rest support their flanks. The 6th Army was a consolidation of the best troops left in the Wehrmacht, and they had been sent to take Stalingrad. Stalin would never allow the city bearing his name to fall to the enemy, though the Germans would still capture it, but not before their flank collapsed and they would be surrounded. 300,000 Nazis of the German 6th Army would be killed, at the cost of 1 million Soviets. This isn't meant to be a play-by-play of the Eastern Front, but it's important to show the degrading effectiveness of the German military. They would never recover from this loss, and it became a slow, bleeding defeat. Fighting wouldn't end for 4 years, but that's because there was no surrender. The Russians had to burn Berlin to the ground. A less ideological leader may have included the Japanese in their war plans. The Second Front against the Russians would have meant their swift downfall. Listening to his generals and taking Moscow in the summer of '41 would have crippled the Soviet capacity to coordinate its large-scale industrial movement. Declaring war on the US after Pearl Harbor, even though it didn't have to, opened up another front in Africa and eventually in France. And diverting precious manpower to the Holocaust instead of the Eastern Front surely didn't help their staggering losses. People don't discuss it enough. Hitler almost won. He conquered all of Europe and couldn't maintain his momentum against the Russians because of the weather. The Americans didn't save the world. FDR even told Churchill that the priority was the Nazis. Defeating the Nazis meant the destruction of the Japanese, but defeating the Japanese didn't mean the defeat of the Nazis. If we look at the casualty numbers on each front, an overwhelming majority came in the East. Beside all of the horrific things that Stalin did to his people and the people he conquered, the Soviets still saved the world, at the cost of 30 million people.